Hello and welcome to my channel. The title of this video is A Basic Study of Lord Indra in the Vedas Part 2, focusing specifically on the terrestrial and yogic Indras. Quote, Indra discovered the clouds in the region of the rivers. He set open the portals of the waters, whose dwelling is in the clouds. Indra, in the form of Gandharva Vishvavasu, proclaimed the ambrosial waters. He knew the strength of the dragons. Unquote. Introduction. The first part of this study focused exclusively on the celestial use of the term Indra in the Vedas Samhitas. In this second part of the study, we will examine two other uses for this term in an effort to understand the full scope of its meaning within the text. One mode of this term is the terrestrial Indra, as perceived by man in the external world, or the macrocosm, while the other is the expression of Indra within man himself, or the microcosm. Finally, we will briefly analyze ancient European manifestations of the celestial Lord Indra. The terrestrial Indra, the sky. Western Indologists have often classified Indra in their rather musty catalogues as a rain god. Even from a naked and savage materialistic reading of the text stripped of deeper meaning, this is technically not even correct. He is a sky god by their categorization. In describing this manifestation of Indra, the Brahmins chant in the Yajurveda, Indra is vaster than the earth. The terrestrial Indra in the outer world is the visible sky. The sky dominates the landscape, and it also is, from the vantage point of human perspective, appears to control the weather. Even with all our advanced technology here at the beginning of the 21st century, the power of the weather can still easily overwhelm all our precautions and ravage our food sources. But it is also necessary for our survival. Thus, metaphorically, the visible sky expresses many of the attributes of the celestial Lord Indra to man visibly in the objective world. Quote, The 7 rivers display his glory. Heaven, earth, and the sky display his visible form. The sun and moon, Indra, perform their revolutions that we may see and have faith in what we see. Unquote. In this verse, beyond the sky and firmament as the visible form of Indra, he is also identified with the earth. This expansion of the metaphor is fairly unique, as he is usually not associated with the earth save in a handful of verses, but is most often represented in terms of weather phenomena, such as the showerer and the Lord of Clouds. This is seen most clearly in the translation of the conflict with the Asuras into the atmospheric domain. The Atmospheric Asuras. Quote, Exhilarated by Soma juice, Indra, armed with the thunderbolt, severed the rain-confining cloud, whereupon the currents of water proceeded towards the ocean like birds to their own nest. Unquote. Beyond the power and majesty of the sky, as a poetic representation of the king of Devas, the sages of the Vedic era saw projected upon the amphitheater of the sky the dominant myths of the Rig Veda, which are related to Lord Indra's struggles with the Asuras. The firstborn of the Asuras from the goddess Danu was Vritra. He lends his name as a synonym to all of the Asuras as Vritras in the Vedas. In his terrestrial form, Vritra is identical with the dark clouds. Not only are such clouds dark and physically threatening with the potential danger from winds, but poetically they were seen by the sages as withholding the rain and obscuring the sunlight. In this aspect, Vritra, who is identified with these clouds, is given epitaphs by the sages that express this motif, such as rain arresting and obstructor of waters. In a variety of mantras, he is said to be withholding the waters of the clouds in his darkness. The mutilation of Vritra after his defeat by Indra in this context could be understood as the dispersal of the storm clouds against the background of the sky, or simply causing them to release the rain. Quote, "You, thunderer, have set free the obstructed clouds in their seasons. You have invigorated the strength of the clouds, fierce Indra, destroying the mighty Ahi when slumbering in the waters. You have established the reputation of your prowess. The wielder of the thunderbolt, the render of the rain cloud, has destroyed with his bolt the mighty Shushna, the wrath-born son of the Danava, the walkers in darkness, the protector of those showering clouds, exhilarating himself with the food of these living creatures." Unquote. Thus, the two dominant traits of the Asuras in the Vedas, acculturation and darkness, are expressed in this imagery and psychologically projected onto the atmosphere. This is why, as an additional example, the eclipse has an Asuric association in the Rig Veda as well. It is the sky, or the terrestrial Indra, which slays the clouds in the same manner as the celestial king of Devas to win booty from the Asuras, or here to release the fertilizing rains for the Aryan tribes. The sages go so far as to pray that these rains would not benefit their enemies, the nomadic Dasyus. The seers convey this idea of the liberation of the rains in epitaphs which attribute this to the terrestrial Indra, such as heavy cloud destroyer and he who fractures the clouds. He is also called by them cloud-born. He is further honored by the sages also as the Lord of Clouds. In the hymns of the Samaveda, he is also said to burst clouds. Quote, "Vritra's devourer, he who bursts the clouds, breaks forts and drives the floods, Indra." Unquote. This task is accomplished with his primary weapon, the thunderbolt. For the terrestrial Indra, this is the literal lightning. In the Vedas, this is a form of Agni. This is the physical phenomenon as opposed to the artifact made for the celestial Lord Indra by the great architect of the universe, Lord Vishwakarma. The hymns themselves make it clear that these are distinct. Rain. Thus, the terrestrial Indra is seen as an important cause of rain by slaying the cloud monsters and causing the rain to fall. In the semi-arid land of the seven rivers, this is an important function. It is a boon sought from a wide variety of devas in the hymns, especially in the Rig Veda. He is labeled in a variety of these verses as the sender of the rain. And it is also said that his swift horses announce the rain. He is also called the showerer. Quote, "You, Indra, who are the showerer, have been born the most bountiful of beings. We associate with you all good offspring. End quote. This association with the rain is not restricted to the Rig and Sama Vedas, but continues into the later Vedas as well. In the Atharva Veda, the sages prayed for seasonable rains, saying, quote, "May this our Lord of cloudy sky, bedewed with liquid drops, preserve unequal riches in our homes. Thou, Deva, bedewed with drops, art Lord of infinite prosperity. Grant us therefore that we may enjoy this boon of thine." Unquote. This motif is invoked in other matters as well. For example, in the prayer for the dedication of a newly cut water channel, the drama of Indras liberating the waters from the rain from the Atmospheric Asuras is also mentioned. Quote, "As ye, when Ahi had been slain, flowed forth together with a roar, so are ye called the roaring ones. This, O ye rivers, is your name." Unquote. In the later hymns, Indra's beard is described as bedewed with rain, which he brings like herds. Thus, this mythic imagery is not restricted to the Rig and Sama Vedas, but is found throughout the whole of the Vedic corpus. Counterpoint: the slaying of Vritra as historical memory. There are some who interpret these motifs of Indra slaying Vritra and freeing the waters not as mythopoetic motifs projected onto the weather, but as distorted historical memory of the collapse of the glaciers of the Himalayas to release torrents of floodwaters into the Ganges Valley. This is not my personal view, but it is certainly one worth noting. This opinion is expressed by a variety of authors. Among them is Dr. Priyadarshi in his 2014 work In Quest of the Dates of the Vedas. There, he correlates the breaking and melting of the glaciers on the Himalayas around 9500 BC with this legend, and uses this as a data point for dating the Vedic tradition. The second point in building his case is the etymological work of Monier-Williams regarding the name Vritra, which comes from the root VR, vir, which means to cover. Quote, "Vritra is a personification of a natural phenomena, no doubt, but it is difficult to retain water in the clouds for too long. Therefore, Monier-Williams, this part of his assumption is not correct. In fact, the water was covered inside the glaciers, which indeed lay on the Himalayan mountains. That abode of Vritra was on the mountains has been explicitly mentioned in the Rig Veda, in Mandala 1, hymn 34, verse 2. Vritra has been understood and explained more appropriately by Bhagwan Singh as the glaciers and sheets of ice over mountains, the lakes which started melting as the floods when the warmer period came." Unquote. He then continues to support this with some intriguing observations. Quote, "We know that below the sheets of ice, which exist in liquid form in bodies of water in the freezing cold regions, the epithet Purandara, used for the water god Indra, has confused the authors for 2 centuries, and they have thought that it means breaker of forts. This conception of the Purandara is wrong. Pura means any human settlement larger than about 300 kilometers, and Dara means stream. Indra, being the god of waters, is the Purandara, or the source of the waters coming to the human settlements. In fact, the currents of the rivers of the region, particularly the Saraswati, was so strong that it destroyed the human settlements located on the banks of the river of the region during the early Holocene. Unquote. It is my personal view that there are verses which refer to the liberation of rivers that are historical memories, but I think they represent conflicts between the 5 tribes and the Harappans, who would dam the rivers or build dikes to control the water, and this may have deprived the Aryan homesteads of water for their crops. One of which we know from the Rig Veda they grew was rice, which is very water intensive. I explore this in my study, Villains of the Vedas, Part 3, the Asuras, in more details with all of the relevant mantras. 2 rain motifs, cattle and maruts. In examining the full scope of the verses related to these subjects, it appears, though not absolute, that the seers tend to use 2 dominant motifs related to the subject of rain. In one set of verses, the rain is portrayed as cattle, while in the other, rains are represented as the terrestrial maruts, who appear significantly identified with the monsoons. Cow motif. Quote, I praise in hymns the mighty Indra, the augmenter of waters, who clove for Trishoka the broad womb-like cloud and made a path for the cows to issue forth. Unquote. One descriptive motif found in the hymns is that which portrays the rains as cattle. Given the docile nature of the cow, this would seem to indicate rains which are both gentle and nourishing. In this metaphor, the rains as cattle are associated with the dominant myth of the Rig Veda, the rescue of the stolen cattle. The Asuras, generally under the leadership of Bala, steal the cows and hide them in a cave in an inaccessible region. The path to this remote location must be discovered, and then the cows liberated from their confinement after the Asura champion is defeated. The identity of the cows is fluid. In some versions, they are associated with the rain, but in others with light and also ambrosia. Most often, the villains are the Asuras, but they may also be the Panis, who are generally associated with the nomadic Dasyus, who are the enemies of the 5 tribes. In such versions, this is reflecting the common conflicts and struggles of the tribal era in an archetypal mythic form. Generally, the hero of the legend is, of course, Lord Indra, who slew Balasura, although the path is often found by an obscure figure named Sarama. However, there are multiple versions of the characters of this legend, and the hero is sometimes Lord Agni, the Ashvins, Lord Brihaspati, whose cattle are generally stolen, or even Soma. In some, the ancestors of the sages themselves find and liberate the cows. Only the fundamental structure is constant, and the motif of liberation from the forces of darkness and obstruction. Marut motif. Often in the hymns of the Vedas, Maruts are celestial armies which are attached to a deva. The terrestrial form of them is identified with the powerful and potentially destructive monsoon rains, although some assert that they are more closely related to the winds, than the actual rains themselves. In this form, they are called the leaders of rains and clouds. They are also specifically represented as the monsoon downpours in descriptions of them that they roar like lions and pour down the showers of vigorous strength. They are also compared to rushing bulls. They clearly represent a more aggressive form of the rains compared to the passive kind. These two distinct motifs lead to the question of why there should be such divergent descriptions. Is it merely poetic exuberance of the sages, or might there be a subtle difference which animates these two metaphors? One method of examining this issue is from a chronological perspective. While it does appear that most of the verses which associate the Maruts with the monsoons are in the later mandalas of the Rig Veda, this is not exclusively so, as they are also associated with this imagery in the family books, which are the older strata. The cattle motif is also present in both layers, thus a chronological analysis does not yield any significant results. The simple observational view may be that they represent different types of rain. The Maruts, or the monsoons, are more violent than the cattle rains, we might call them, which are more gentle and nourishing. My suspicion is that there's more here, and this is a subject which requires further research. The academic materialist reductionist view. Quote, "It is evident that in nearly all of these combinations, one characteristic regularly recurs. The origin of the divine beings, including those which appear most unequivocally to represent ethical forces or influences active in human culture, is traced back to the powers of nature. The fundamental nature of the primary Indian religion, surviving from the very remotest antiquity and rising to the surface of the Vedic era as a more or less ruinous wreckage, is, as we have seen, essentially that of a savage's religion." Unquote. So says Oldenburg, hero of Witzel. It is the view of some scholars that this set of images, which I am categorizing as the terrestrial Indra, is in fact the whole of the god to the ancient sages. There was nothing else, they say. Granting them, for the sake of argument alone, the inane idea that the seers of the Vedas were unable to figure out, after long lives on earth, that they did not have to run and perform a ritual for the sun to shine after a storm, as they certainly must have seen this happen in their lives without pouring out the Soma brew, this is still not consistent with all the mantras in the Vedas in which the term Indra appears. It is like trying to pound a square peg into a round hole, to use a classic expression in English. How does the sky, for example, have different forms? It's always blue. How could the sky have appeared and been locally visible to the seers and Brahmins in their rites upon the grass in the hall of sacrifice in a chariot with horses. What's the chariot of the sky? It's just this big blue dome up there. The list of questions based on the celestial king of Devas, of course, could go on. Clearly, this term is not reducible to a single meaning. The model which Oldenburg proposes cannot be sustained based upon a consistent examination of all the chronologically relevant sources in the text. The academic response to this critique would be to assert that the explanations of these distinctions and the use of the term Indra in the Vedas, to take our current example, is due to the developmental differences. The nature use is the more primitive and older, while the personal deva use is a later development projecting human personality and characteristics upon the older form that were completely initially absent. This is certainly a reasonable approach in some scenarios, but is problematic for one very simple reason. Such a chronological transition cannot be determined from the hymns themselves. It is a purely theoretical assumption without evidential foundations in the text. The various uses of the term Indra are all contemporary. There is no proof of any change within what are established parameters for the different chronological layers of the Rig Veda. The Yogic Indra, the biographical ego of man. The Microcosm. Quote, "One who knows man thinks, this is Brahma, for all the devas are seated in him, as cows in a stall." Unquote. The term microcosm is one borrowed from Western Hermetic thought. While useful for this discussion, it should be borne in mind that any such constructs are inherently limiting and flawed, especially when we begin to explore the subject of the limitless I consciousness within man. The sages of the Atharva Veda, as just quoted, teach that all devas are within man. This is a very dense phrase, which requires meditative reflection as well as much logical analysis. These statements can be subject to fundamental misunderstandings, at least in my view. There are some who may read these, especially through the cracked and stained spectacles such as those of Freud, and conclude that the devas are merely psychological projections without existence in themselves. Others would understand this to mean that they are merely states of mind or perhaps tones of feeling without reference to external reality. If one is experiencing compassion, then this alone is the Deva realm, as there is no such ethereal geography out there in any independent realm of the multiverse. If you are charged up and focused to fight in the dojo, then you're in the Asura realm. Another view of what the sages are teaching is that the external or terrestrial forms, in my terminology, of the devas are reflected in forces of nature, which also exist within the individual both psychologically and energetically, or we might say etherically. This is why astrology works. Thus, the reason why the seers call the sacred fire with its transformative power Agni and the life force chi or prana within man is also Agni is to communicate to us that that which is external is also that which is internal. It's the same phenomenon. This tradition survived in the Mediterranean world as the Western Hermetic tradition with its dictum, as above, so below. But this goes one step further in that the dualist concept of the objective and the subjective are not accurate measures of the full scope of reality. The metaphysical ground upon which the drama of the interplay of opposites unfolds is limitless I consciousness. As the sages of the Atharva Veda tell us, the spirit dwelling on earth is single. Just one. That means there is only one eternal spirit, or one eternal consciousness, or one eternal subject in an external world of appearance filled with a googolplex number of transient objects. It is here that the term microcosm loses its value, as it implies that the individual is a reflection of the whole, when, in the ultimate reality, the true self, with a capital S, of the individual is the actual whole itself. There is no absolute distinction in truth. The empirical ego. To experience the games of this interplay of the opposites, consciousness through the medium of primeval energy manifests the empirical ego. This is similar to the manifestation of Lord Indra we saw in part 1 of this study, where the seers of the Atharva Veda told us the bright Viraj grew potent Indra self. Viraj is a synonym in the Vedas for the primordial energy of creation. This is also called Vak. Through reflection, we can observe this in ourselves and in others. Pardon me, please. Man is not born with an ego, but with the raw materials from which it develops with verbal expression under the force of the interplay of genetic material and environmental factors, both of which are growing from past karma. However, we are all born with complete and intact consciousness, which is perfectly aware within us from the beginning. Ego is developmental. Consciousness is not identical with the ego because it is innate and unchanging. The vehicle of that consciousness to interact and experience this world of appearances and objects is the biographical or the empirical ego, which emerges. This empirical ego, or biographical as it is formed by life experience and its limited history, within us dominates the psychic landscape in the same manner as the sky dominates and defines the horizons of our natural perceptions in the external world. Further, like the celestial Lord Indra, who is the king of Devas and the sovereign within the sphere of the cosmic order, or Lord Vishnu, the biographical ego is what appears to be making the choices of our lives and determine their course. Thus, the biographical ego is the yogic Indra, or the mind as stream of thought within us. Thus far, this has been a philosophical reflection. We will now turn to examine if this thesis can be supported by the materials of the text of the Samhitas themselves. On this subject, of course, I'm not going to go into this in the Upanishads, which would take us into a whole other highway on this subject. I'm just sticking with the Samhitas. Potential indications of the yogic Indra in the text. There are a wide variety of incongruous statements about Lord Indra in the Vedas. These would seem to contradict the general description of the character of the Deva and his responsibilities. The Azur-Chind king of Devas is, for example, the lord of the good, who excludes the wicked from his heavenly realm after death, as we saw in part 1 of the study. However, in a contradictory verse, he is also said to do good and evil repeatedly. Quote, Indra achieves one act today, another tomorrow, evil and good repeatedly. May he and Mitra, Varuna, Pushan, and Arya be on this occasion promoters of the desired results. Unquote. One might interpret this as the weather or the activity of the terrestrial Indra, since these phenomena are unpredictable and can bring both blessings and curses. But in the hymns in general, the destructive aspects of weather are attributed to the Atmospheric Asuras or to the Maruts as the monsoons, of which I should note he, Lord Indra, is not always the leader. Drought is personified as either Rakshasas or the goddess Nritri. In other words, this is not associated with forms of Indra. This leaves the meaning of these verses still in question. This is not the only example of such mantras. In their era, the Vedic sages were highly dubious, to put it mildly, about merchants, especially those who trafficked in the Soma plant or ephedra. Among their practices, which they condemned, was the charging of interest. In one hymn they pray, quote, when were his mighty forces ever languid, referring to Indra? When was aught undestroyed before the slayer of Vritra? Indra, by his energy, overpowered all the huckstering usurers who see only this world's days. Unquote. They were obviously not admirers of the bankers, and we should have these verses, these lines printed up in a plaque and maybe nail it outside of Goldman Sachs or some other such satanic operation that sees only this world's days. A view which they shared, by the way, with many of the Hebrew prophets, such as Amos, although this attitude on the part of the Hebrews changed after the Babylonian exile. Nor does Lord Indra approve of dishonesty and deceit, as honesty is highly valued among the classic Aryan virtues. Yet, despite all of this, in one verse we are told Indra is the author of many delusions. Such dishonest behavior is not consistent with a high regard for truth, especially from a being such as the celestial deva who is beyond illusion. There are verses which say, and we saw this at the end of part 1 of the study, Indra is more generous when drunk, and he gives things away. More rambunctious behavior by Lord Indra is referred to in a legend where he stole the Soma of the other devas. Quote, in the dwelling of Tivashta, Indra drank the costly Soma from the vessels of the offerers. Unquote. On this verse, Sayana notes that Lord Indra came into Lord Vishwakarma's abode uninvited and by force drank the Soma prepared for the other devas. One epitaph found in the hymn, which may be consistent with this behavior, is that of a lowly-minded Indra. Finally, the Samaveda mentions Indra loves praise, although this could be read in a variety of ways, applying to both the celestial and yogic aspects. Examined chronologically, the vast majority of what we are here categorizing as incongruous statements are recorded in the older strata of the Rig Veda or the family books alone. Those who make the argument that Lord Indra has his roots in the person of an historical Aryan chief who was deified over time, there are some Hindus in the subcontinent who accept this thesis, by the way, may find some support for this placement in the text, but we will study that thesis a little later on. However, another possibility to reconcile these verses is that they should be read in conformity with the thesis of the Yogic Indra. They're referring to Indra not as a celestial deva or the visible sky, but in the microcosm as the empirical ego. This may be more consistent than faint reflections of a deified chief, as I am unsure how such a deceased person could make one slothful, but I am well aware of how the empirical ego might make one. And I think, by the way, as an apology, I missed a mantra. There was one which was a prayer to Lord Indra, or to Indra. Mentioning Indra, we'll say, put it more generically, do not make me slothful. The empirical ego in the struggle with Vritra and the legend of the rescue of the stolen kine. This lowly-minded, morally ambiguous, and rather arrogant character of the empirical ego, which boldly proclaims his lordship, as may be indicated by these verses, is the unlikely hero in the yogic or inner version of these two dramas in the Vedas. Vritra. The first, is the conflict with Vritra. The goddess Aditi and the goddess Danu both appear as primeval goddesses in the Rig Veda. Each has a firstborn son who are rivals for cosmic supremacy. Psychologically, Vritra and Indra are thus closely linked, almost like rival twins. This would make Vritra, who represents obstruction and darkness, the shadow side of Indra. All of the dark and obstructing traits of the ego are projected onto this shade, and in defeating him, Indra defeats these aspects of himself and is purified. We just substitute ego for Indra there. This releases the fertilizing psychic energy symbolized by the water of the rain, previously locked away in the psychological complex, which was expressed as Vritra. In psychological terminology, a complex is quite literally an obstruction or a binding of energy. There is a similar archetype in Wagner's operatic cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, where the villain, Schwarz Albrecht, is the shadow side of Licht Albrecht, or Wotan. But I am not going to go off on to that particular operatic cycle because none of you want to sit here for 3 hours and listen to me ramble about it. The rescue of the stolen cattle. In the yogic version of the cattle rescue, the hero is recovering what has been concealed by ignorance, as symbolized by darkness. Psychologically, the archetypal quest to recover lost treasures or states is a common motif in human myths. Here, the treasure is represented by the stolen cattle described as light, or a state of illumination. The nature of this luminosity can be determined by the owner of the cattle the Asura stole. Not only are they of the nature of the Devas in general, but they specifically are the property of Lord Brihaspati. There is some dispute over the question if this Deva in the Vedas is identical with the current bearer of that name, who is Lord Guru or Jupiter. However, like Jupiter, he is said to be a priest of the Devas in the Rig Veda. Thus, the cattle as objects of wealth represent the metaphysical wealth of knowledge at the core of Vedic rituals, which is illuminating. It is the task of the Yogic Indra in this legend laying out, like a psychic guide, to recover the aboriginal knowledge that has been obscured. And some of you may ask, okay, don't keep us in suspense. What is that aboriginal knowledge? I can only give you my opinion as to what it is in the teachings of the Vedas. It's very simple. You are that. Now on to the next subject. Pardon me. Western Aryan parallels. The imagery and activities of Lord Indra in the Vedas could be reduced to a set of elements. When these are examined, it is found that there is a great degree of symmetry with several deities in European myth and legend. The deep connections of what is formally called by that clunky term that I don't like because it's so clumsy, Indo-European folklore are well established, so there's no need to explore and demonstrate that particular thesis here. We may move directly to the question of where the Lord of Fleet Horses may have been manifest in these particular cultural zones. In Northern Europe, one of the closest parallels is with the chief of the Norse pantheon, Odin. However, these are not as close to the certainly more ancient Lord Indra, and this may indicate that the Norse legends are of a much later period. Another limitation in this area is that most of the actual mythic material was purely oral and was lost, or it was recorded by Christians once these cults had passed into history, and thus there's something of a bias. But some of you watching this know all about Christian bias in translating things. A much clearer example with a broader sample of data is found in Southern Europe. Zeus, the father of God and men, as Homer says. The Hellenic god Zeus is much more closely equated with Lord Indra than Odin. Not only is this the case, but it is possible to see in the corpus of the material in which he appears how the Aryan core deva progressed and became associated with other indigenous cults as the tribes migrated into different regions. In the public persona, this removed him from his historical roots in the subcontinent. While there are a variety of distinctions, of course, between Zeus and Lord Indra in their respective legends and imagery, such as the oak tree association with Zeus and the historically more limited role of Zeus in early myths such as Hesiod, in 11 key defining points, they are identical. And we will go through these and mention these briefly. Zeus is associated with the sky, and Indra is called the visible sky. Zeus is the giver of rain, Umbrios, and Indra is the giver of rain. Zeus is dark clouded, Skotitas, and Indra is cloud-born or breaker. Zeus is the lord of lightning, Astropaios. Indra is the wielder of the thunderbolt. Zeus is the savior and hero, Soter. Indra is the protector and hero. Zeus is the giver of property, Ctesius, and Indra is the lord of wealth. Zeus is the king of gods, and Indra is the king of devas. Zeus is the judge, Palamanius, and Indra is the judge, the lord of the good. Zeus was born in a cave. Indra was born in a cave. Zeus is the son of the primeval Titaness mother, Rhea, and Indra is the son of the primeval mother goddess, Aditi. Zeus fought Typhon, a storm snake demon, and Indra, of course, fought Vritra, a storm dragon or snake demon. Zeus then is a form of Lord Indra expressed through a different cultural matrix. As an aside, they also both received the same domestic animals as sacrifices, which were bulls, cows, and goats, but that could easily be coincidence, and some of you, of course, don't believe that there were actual animal sacrifices in the Vedic era. It can be established that Lord Indra is the older form and thus the source when the distinctions between these two manifestations are compared. How can we do that? The key here is found in genealogy. While elements are retained in the European Zeus, there are actually three distinct versions of his birth and youth. There are two Akkadian and one Cretan. The Cretan version, related in Hesiod, is the tale of crooked-minded Kronos, as Homer called him, swallowing his children. In the Akkadian version, that of Zeus Lukaios, he was raised by three nymphs in the mountains and was the son of Aether and Chelos, or, if we put that in Sanskrit, Prana and Diuloka, respectively, and could go off in all sorts of areas on all that, especially with the three nymphs and the three forms of the goddess. But we don't want to be here for 2 hours. In the other of the Doanan Zeus, he's identical with the oracle in the sacred oak grove in Epirus. These distinctions most likely reflect the identification of the core deva with other local cults. In the Vedas, on the other hand, there is one genealogy of Lord Indra. This is despite the erroneous claim he was an Asura or a child of Danu who became identified with the Adityas later. We touched on that in part 1. There is one more very important fact which can be discovered by this comparative study. Very early on in the Rig Veda, the seers recognized the fundamental unity of all devas and forces as manifestations of the ultimate reality. Quote, O Soma Pavamana, you are the thrice 11 universal devas abiding in the secret heaven, unquote. As noted in the first part of the study, those who worshipped Lord Indra as the Supreme Lord also portrayed the universe as a manifestation of Lord Indra. Quote, all the stars and planets twinkling in the abode of the sun are the varied forms of Lord Indra. Viz. Lord Indra is the sole convener of the illuminating and breathing power in all these three worlds, unquote. This same idea would develop among the Greeks, but it was not for centuries later. If we assume the validity of the academic dates, even from the later materials of the Atharva Veda alone, and we're making a big assumption there, the Vedic sages were still more than 500 years ahead of the Greeks before such cosmological identifications of Zeus as the ultimate reality were publicly made by philosophers in Hellas. Quote, hence as the universe great Jove contains, extended ether, heaven's exalted plains, the barren sea, wide-bosomed earth renowned, ocean immense, and Tartarus profound, fountains and rivers, and the boundless main, with all that nature's ample realm contains, all gods and goddesses of each degree, all that is part, and that or shall be, occultly and in fair connection lies, in Jove's vast belly, ruler of the skies, unquote, to quote Proclus. And just as an aside, of course, note the vast belly motif. I've seen that in the Rig Veda. The aforementioned in this study, Western Indologist Oldenburg, claimed that the Vedic sages were not as intellectually evolved as the ancient Greek thinkers. By this, I assume he means the pre-Socratics. This is clearly incorrect and may be added to the long list of his published errors. So why anyone still takes him seriously is I can't answer that question. While latent in Orphic thought, it would not be until Hermeticism that Western man would fully realize the truth of the ultimate reality known since the ancient days of the Rig Veda, that as the microcosm we are that ultimate reality, as that which is below, or subjective man, is identical to that which is above, the objective world. To quote one of my favorite verses from the Rig Veda on this, he is Hamsa, the sun, dwelling in light, Vasu, the wind, dwelling in the firmament, the invoker of the Devas, Agni, dwelling on the fire, on the altar, the dweller among men as consciousness. Unquote. A counterpoint. The deified chief theory. There is a string of opinion from a variety of quarters, not simply the Western Indologist, that the head of the Vedic pantheon was an historical person who was deified over time and became, in popular belief, the person of the celestial Lord Indra. Pardon me, please. This historical analysis is shared by some in the subcontinent. One of them is Dr. S.S. Gupta in his work, A Study of Deities of Rig Veda. In this he argues, quote, no devata, or deity, is known to have such a large number of friends and enemies. Only a man, and that a king or leader of tribe can have that distinction, unquote. He further argues that no non-corporeal entity, such as a deva, could provide the material blessings that were given by this ancient chieftain to his people. He specifically enumerates corn, protection of cattle, houses, and animals. We've seen the list in part 1 of the study. Dr. Gupta concludes this list saying, quote, certainly these are not the doings of a deity. Only a man can do it, unquote. His assumption is that entities such as the devas are unable to produce results in the material world. Thus, these must be categorized as activities of a human being. It should be noted that this view undermines the whole system of Vedic sacrifice. You could argue that in some aspects it undermines the whole of Hinduism. This is echoed by Singhal and Gupta, although not with that same argument. Let me be clear. In chapter 5 of their work, The Ancient History of India, the Vedic Period. Such a view is shared by surprising sources which are not modern. These are found regarding the Western parallels to Lord Indra. In the Middle Ages, the Christian convert and retired Viking Snorri Sturluson composed a work on the history of the kings of Iceland and various related events in Northern Europe from its settlement entitled Lives of the Norse Kings. In this, he propounds a theory regarding the origins of the Norse god Odin. He describes Odin as an ancient chief who was a remarkably powerful shaman and warlord. He was so revered that after his death he was deified. Quote, men sacrificed to Odin and his 12 chieftains and called them their gods and long afterwards believed in them. Unquote. Of course, as noted, he was a Christian, so he's going to attempt to rationalize paganism in this manner. But this isn't the case in our next example. In southern Europe, there is also evidence that this view was held from far back into the classical era itself in at least some quarters regarding Zeus. In Crete, down to the 4th century AD, there was an ancient tomb which bore the rough inscription, Zeus, son of Kronos. This was advertised as the tomb of Zeus as a mortal chief who became deified after death, and his legend developed. I seem to have a memory of Cicero going into this subject, but I didn't want to dig into his work De Deorum and get into that too much. So it's rambling around my head somewhere, but perhaps in some future study I'll find that and note that for everyone. But to continue, as a thesis, this is not subject to documented proof given the paucity of chronological records to document this allegedly evolutionary transformation through several generations. It is only demonstrable based upon inductive arguments from analogy, because the pharaohs, for example, were mortal kings who became identified with divine forces after death. Therefore, the same is true of deep historical persons such as Indra, whose legends would spread not only through the subcontinent but into Europe, doesn't necessarily hold. But of course, the ancient region, which is still in dispute, is not ancient Egypt, so what proof is there that the same cultural dynamics which generated the Egyptian view were in play in what Sethna calls the Aryan belt? Were the same degrees of centralization and hierarchical power and force? Very unlikely. After all, not all chiefs and kings of all peoples in the ancient world became gods. So this is not a perfectly sound induction. The assumption of this historical analysis also is that there are only definable forces from material causes acting in the world, and thus all must be reducible to them. There cannot be any gods. Thus, Indra must have been a human or a force of nature or whatever, and this proves, therefore, there was no divine, which is, of course, circular logic. This argument is based purely on speculation and rests upon analogy and an atheistic worldview. Speaking personally, I reject it as inconclusive. This concludes this introductory study of the subject of Lord Indra in the Vedas Samhitas. I hope that this video has been both informative and challenging, and it is also to be hoped that it will motivate those of you watching to further investigate this subject and learn more. Thank you very much for your time.